The first time Mira tried to remember rain, she began with the sound of it on a broad leaf, a sound like small hands practicing a rhythm they had not been taught. The city had forgotten such sounds. It had remembered peeling paint and dust that moved like a low fog when a truck passed. It had remembered the hollow clatter of dry gutters and the taste of metal when the wind blew from the desert. But rain had left so long ago that it was not even a rumor. It was a shape missing from the city's mouth. Mira worked at the Registry of Ordinary Phenomena, a building that once kept records of births and boundaries and now kept records of smaller things that still held the city together. The people who filed in from the hard light brought with them the ordinary that was slowly vanishing. A list of smells captured in cotton. A notebook of shadows mapped at noon over one old courtyard. A sequence of temperatures drawn on the back of a receipt because the day had doubled back on itself and someone needed proof that heat could bend. Her job was to accept whatever people feared would slip. Some days this meant cataloging the precise way a baker left flour on a counter, an oval that no longer formed because there was no wheat. Some days this meant a stitch, the tightness of it, the way an aunt showed a niece and the niece forgot. On the walls of the registry, among the microscopes and the careful lamps, there were shelves of jars labeled with the kinds of silence found at the edge of different neighborhoods. She had calibrated them herself, holding each one to her ear like a seashell, and learning that silence could be as firm as a stone and as porous as a sponge. The city compensated the registry not because it valued these things, but because believing in the continuity of the ordinary helped keep the streets calm. People visited to sit with a memory and leave knowing that somewhere someone was keeping track, even if the ledger counted sensations. The registry presented its quarterly reports in a format the council could read, reducing the stupendous particularity of daily life into numbers that would be filed away. 6 new angles of shade, 3 amended lullabies, 1 extinct whistle between teeth. The council members nodded and returned to the arithmetic of water that always outnumbered them. In the mornings, Mira arranged the queue. She stood at the door with a cloth kerchief pinned to her nose, not because the air was always bad, but because it reminded people that breathing would not always come free. She guided them toward benches and fans and the cool jars where mint leaves rested. People told her they came because she did not speak like a clerk. She asked them to describe what they were losing with a kind of exactness they had forfeited in other matters. They did not need to use big words. They simply had to hold their thought still long enough for her to pin it. Mira took everything down in a careful hand. She did not replace the missing. She annotated the void. When the day was over, she wrapped herself in a thin shawl, the color of a cloud that had failed to form, and walked home through streets that had learned to begin before dawn and fold by mid-afternoon. She grew the kinds of plants that could live on gray water and spoke to them without speaking. She had a basin and 2 buckets and a jar that used to hold peaches. On the wall over the basin, she kept a drawing of a broad leaf with the imagined sound of rain written beneath it in notes that had no notation. The city had an old riverbed that pretended to be a park. The trees were the kind that knew how to wait. Their leaves were stiff and would not whisper, even if a wind came. Mira walked the riverbed in the evenings, counting the benches that had split under heat, imagining sitting on each one. The park lights switched on not at sunset, but when the temperature slipped below what the city considered safe. Only then did people drift in, carrying chairs and cards, pulling sleeves down over wrists that had not been bare outside for many months. The conversations were small, a cousin seen at a clinic, a pipe that held, a child who could add columns fast. The city had cultivated competence in these particulars, not out of pride, but necessity. Near the northern end of the dry riverbed stood the weather office, a low structure with a tower just tall enough to see the edges of them all. The office had been officially shuttered twice and reopened in a diminished form each time by a ballot measure whose language no one liked and whose outcome no one could avoid. The office now issued advisories that were more like apologies for not being able to do what it had originally been built to do. On those evenings when the sky found color at the horizon, people turned to the tower as if it were a lighthouse at the edge of something bigger than the city. The tower's instruments still whirred, still sent data to screens that still worked. But the data was a map of a continent that had learned a new grammar, and the instruments were old teachers who could not correct it. Mira had never worked for the weather office, but she knew the woman who kept the instruments alive there. Her name was Ela, and she walked like someone who had learned to keep a cadence independent of circumstance. She came to the registry twice a month to sit with a jar of late afternoon breeze. The jar had been sealed outside the weather office tower before the shutters. Ela had told Mira without telling her that the jar held a certain rhythm that the new currents did not reproduce, a rhythm that made numbers line up in her mind the way they had in the years when she was trained. Mira had calibrated the jar in her ledger, noting that the city's late afternoons had lost several of their earlier gears. The night before the first rumor of rain reached the city, Mira received a message from the weather office that was not a formal advisory. It was a line of numbers that adjusted for a kind of turbulence daytime heat had been practicing. She read it and paused. The registry received such messages sometimes, just as it sent back measurements of things no one else tracked. She considered where to file it, then folded it into a pocket she reserved for those small items that might suddenly become larger. At dawn, the line at the registry had already formed. People seemed to carry a nervous abundance, as if they had brought not just one vanishing habit, but many. A street vendor had catalogued not just the precise weight of a paper cone of nuts, but the order in which regulars arrived for them on days when the sky went milky. A teacher brought in the sensation of chalk on a fingertip, index and middle finger both, because the new markers were cheap and harsh, and the blackboard had become an image on a screen. An old man brought the smell of his corner barber shop, loaded in a swatch of cloth from a chair he could not afford to keep in the family anymore. He told Mira with a careful breath that the chair had been his brother's. He did not say that his brother had left, and he did not need to. The city had become fluent in what did not need to be said. By mid-morning, a different kind of movement gathered 2 blocks over. Mira did not follow crowds when she was working, but a murmur developed like a threaded sound that pulled even her attention away from the copy she made of one woman's recipe for a soup that required a carrot so slender that it had become laughter in that kitchen. Mira asked her assistant to hold the queue together, put the ledger on the counter, and stepped into the street. The crowd had formed around a truck that had stopped under a faded billboard. The truck had a speaker and a single banner that did not declare a party or a brand. It declared a forecast. The forecast was not a promise. No one used that word anymore. It was a window and a question and a call to spend a particular hour somewhere because it might matter. The forecast being announced was the kind that had run through the city before, with variations. Wind would come in from the southeast in the late evening and bring particulate matter that would make breathing more difficult. People should stay inside in certain buildings where filters were still maintained. There would be water distribution points that were not the usual ones because some would be inaccessible. This was not news. It was advice in the guise of news. People listened because the tone of the man speaking through the truck's speaker did not claim to control anything. He offered a way to count a few steps ahead of a known retreat. The second part of the forecast came like a stone thrown into the crowd's quiet. There was a chance that before the southeast wind, there would be a small cell of moisture forming over the northern stones and moving toward the city. There was a chance of rain. The word did not ring like it did in old songs. It did not send people to windows like a child who hears a favorite neighbor's knock. It moved through the crowd as a new kind of risk, a live wire so rarely seen that everyone who heard it took a half-step backward without deciding to. Mira found the edge of the crowd where Ayla stood with her hands in her pockets. Ayla's eyes were on the sky, which was already gathering into a pale dome that could as well have been a ceiling. The weather office had not issued anything in writing. The truck spoke on. The word rain did not repeat. People looked at one another with the same expression they used when a street rumor said a store had restocked something it had not had for months. They moved and did not move. The city barely breathed, and then it resumed what it had been doing before, because nothing had changed, and everything had. The registry grew louder. People returned with new requests. They wanted Mira to file not only their vanishing habits, but also their claims on what rain would be when it came. A woman asked whether she could reserve the sound of rain on the corrugated roof outside the room where her mother slept. A boy wanted to record the behavior of puddles as they formed at a corner he had swept with a broom. A man wanted to be sure that if rain came and then ended, it would not be forgotten again, without being properly counted. Mira took their forms, printed their names, kept her face even. She had no authority to grant anyone a claim on the future. She had skills that belong to those who are trusted to, in the absence of water, record the things that water once did. Ella appeared at the counter in mid-afternoon. She was not carrying a jar. She was carrying the tower's smaller anemometer, the one she used when larger instruments failed. It had a nick in one cup. She put it on the counter with the small care of someone setting down a sleeping infant. She asked for nothing. She waited while Mira finished transcribing a grandmother's note on the shape a steam cloud used to make above a certain kettle. Mira wrote the final word, placed the form in the tray, and looked at the anemometer. Ella told Mira without speaking that the air was building a pattern. The pattern was not familiar and not unfamiliar. It was evidence that the sky was not blank. Ayla traced the shape of it with her finger on the counter. Mira recognized her method. It was the way someone traces a map for a person who cannot read, but who can feel movement under the finger and learn that rooms connect. Mira thought of the number line Ayla had sent before dawn. She imagined it folded into this pattern like a paper model learning to stand. The city's hours slid toward evening. The heat was a single field. On the edge of the registry's property, a small tree watched forgetfully. Beyond it, the tower stood like an index finger against the block of sky. People moved toward water distribution points that were always more about time than vessels. One waited for a number, and when the number came, one swapped it for 2 or 3 containers, took a paper instruction for filters, and walked back to a door that opened slowly. People learned to carry not just water, but the request to be patient with the one who carried it. In her apartment, Mira prepared for a night that would be spent awake. She pulled a chair to the window that looked at the narrow strip of street and the farther strip of sky. She lined the sill with jars from the registry that contained nothing of value beyond their sturdiness. She placed shallow bowls beneath them. She did not call what she intended an experiment. She called it attention in the form of glass. The city felt it before it heard anything. The feeling was a kind of lifting at the scalp, an involuntary readiness in the skin. A vehicle could produce the second and third order harmonics of this, and so could certain songs. But this was older. People in the city did what animals do when weather turns. They raised their heads. They stood without knowing why. They waited without calling it waiting. Children noticed that adults had fallen into a quiet stance otherwise reserved for important announcements. Something was watching them with nothing that could be called eyes. Something was taking a breath. The first soft contact did not disturb dust. It did not change a color or mark a surface in the way Mira had rehearsed seeing. It touched the outermost leaves of a plant that had not been irrigated in days and made a sound that was almost too small to matter. Mira had expected intensity, a rattling like gravel thrown against a window, a dramatic return. What she received was an adjective so gentle that her mind refused to commit a noun to it. Then the sound built in layers. It created territory on metal roofs and on wires. It rehearsed itself on the shoulders of stone statues left from a municipal era that believed commemorating would make a thing endure. It found the cardboard over holes and the tiles that had broken and the plastic where only tin had once lain. The sound did not align with anyone's memory because too many materials had changed, but a relationship was re-emerging. Water was conversing with gravity in public again, and the city had to listen even if it could only understand a fragment of the grammar. Mira kept the jars open. She kept her hands on the window frame to remind herself that the frame still held. Her arms trembled in a way she did not try to still. The bowls began to gather thin films that would later be poured into the jars. She did not calculate the volume. She counted breaths between drops and stopped when the intervals lost meaning. She could hear people in other rooms, not crying, not rejoicing, simply shifting the way one shifts when a guest enters a room that has been empty a very long time. One does not rush to greet. One realigns. The rain lasted as long as a short song. It moved in like a careful visitor and departed as if it remembered a promise elsewhere. It left behind a surface to the world that had been missing. The surfaces it made were thin and disappearing even as one watched them. They translated light differently, making the air appear more dimensional and each object briefly less separate from its neighbor. The city watched a version of itself that had liquid seams and a sheen where there had only been matte before. It was not awe. It was a small reintroduction to a way of being in which time included a more generous present. The southeast wind arrived later with its harshness. It brought the forecast everyone knew would follow the rumor. Filters went on and doors closed. People moved away from windows and kept their hands busy. The rain's small afterimage lingered only where it had penetrated deeper than a surface. It remained in the smell of the first dust it had touched, mixing with it to produce a scent that had once been walrus leather strong and was now more like a remembering of remembering. Mira poured what she had gathered into jars and sealed them, labeling each with a note so careful it looked more like music than handwriting. In the morning, the sky had returned to its flat language, and the city returned to its practices. People would mention the night and then mention other things. Some would choose an hour to stand alone on their rooftops and count the breaths between their hearts and their steps. Children would recreate the night with cups and taps and learn to spill without being scolded. The registry opened on time. Mira visited her shelves and felt the weight of the jars she had filled. They were not heavy. They were heavy only in the way a thing becomes when one understands its context. People arrived with new requests that had the tone of someone asking for a service that cannot be provided. They wanted their own rain pinned. They wanted a witness to what had touched them. They wanted to avoid the feeling of waking from a dream and failing to write it down, only to discover at noon that the day had erased it. Mira accepted what she could. She invited them to describe the precise sound their roofs had made and to distinguish the sound of water on plastic from water on tin. She asked them to record the behavior of their plants. She showed them how to clean leaves without wasting liquid. She taught them to notice where the wind had pushed the first wave and where the second had gone, taught them to map this in their courtyards as if they were mapping small rivers within a house. The city's council issued a statement reminding everyone that the event had been unlikely and that there would be no similar events in the near forecast. The council did not want to suppress joy, but did want to align expectations with the arithmetic of reservoirs. The statement included a section about gratitude. It listed the actions of the weather office staff and the people who had kept filters in shape. It reminded citizens of the system that allowed any such event to be handled without undue risk. Citizens read it and did not read it. They knew the taste of a statement that kept citizens within the lanes of reason. They did not require scolding. They required someone to keep a ledger not of their errors, but of their realities. Ella came to the registry in the afternoon. She carried the anemometer again. She set it down gently and asked for nothing, because she did not expect compensation for returning something she had borrowed from no one. Mira opened a drawer and produced the smallest of the rain jars. She placed it beside the instrument and did not need to say that this was in exchange for the numbers and the shape traced on the counter, and for the quiet stance a person holds when a whole city begins to relearn something. Ayla placed her hand on the jar without lifting it. The two women stood like that for a moment, then returned to their tasks. In the days that followed, Mira noticed a change in the quality of the quiet brought to the registry. People described their vanishing habits with a new patience. The measures of loss had always been exacting. Now they were exacting in a way that made the registry feel like a joint rather than a warehouse. The difference was not in the number of items. It was in the willingness of people to wait while their grief was translated into language. They did not seem to believe that their requests would produce rain. They seemed to believe that their requests were a practice of care that would be needed whether the sky offered anything again or not. Mira began to prepare an exhibit that had no title. The registry rarely presented exhibits because its purpose was more domestic than public. But the city had responded to rain with both gratitude and a quickly recalibrated restraint, and Mira wanted to give that restraint a room where it could unfold. The exhibit would assemble the ways in which people had described water without seeing it for years, and then how they had described it when it came back for a brief visit. It would not include photographs of the night. It would include textures, tones, and some grammar. It would include a bench positioned in a way that made one feel off balance until one found the center again. She requested space from the council and was offered a disused lobby. The lobby had a wall of polished stone that still held a faint coolness even now. It had doors that no longer opened to anything, and a grand staircase that led to rooms that had been emptied of their former significance. It was a good place for remembering that institutions are temporary frames around persistent human needs. Mira accepted the lobby and set about collecting the parts of the city that could be pinned there without violating anyone's privacy or hope. She worked at night when the streets were quiet and the registry's seeds of activity had blown away. She carried the jars carefully. She hung small wind chimes tuned not to sound, but to silence. Their metal refused to speak unless a very precise angle of air arrived. She laid out maps of courtyards and adjacent alleys, showing how water had moved from one corner to another, from a broken gutter to a surprised drain. She wrote without ornament on the walls, just sentences that described the exact shape a puddle took against a mismatched grid of tiles, and the way a certain plant lifted after the second minute. People arrived in trickles to see the exhibit that had avoided announcing itself. They walked slowly, as if sound would break it. They read the sentences and stood near the jars and did not open them. They traced the maps like someone tracing a childhood street with a finger on a table. They had known this city by the angles of shade and the set of the wind and the registers of heat. Now they knew it briefly by the behavior of water. They were not embarrassed to stand with their hands behind their backs like museum goers in a city that had once had museums. They filled the lobby with the kind of silence that lowers the temperature of a room. A week later, the Weather Office issued a new advisory. The advisory was about heat. It included a line at the end that did not belong to the category. It invited the public to a gathering at the northern end of the dry riverbed at dusk on the following day. It did not call it a ceremony. It called it a recognition. The city responded with the pragmatic curiosity it had learned. People would go and see, and if the gathering did not abuse their time, they would stay for a while. Mira joined the stream moving northward. The sky had found gold at the edges and released it. The light was not a kindness, but it was less than a punishment. Ela stood with the weather office crew near the tower. They had set out a metal table and a small metal box that had the look of science. People gathered around with an easy patience. The box hummed. The tower kept its stubborn finger in the air. Ella opened the box and removed a cylinder. She held it without performing. She explained nothing because the city knew as much about empty announcements as it wanted to know. The act to be recognized was small. The weather office had received, from various corners of the city, sealed jars containing rain from the night of return. The office acknowledged that the jars had not been collected by authorized personnel and that the volumes were inconsistent. The office nonetheless recognized the care that had gone into them. The cylinder held a filter designed for a different purpose. Ela placed the first jar's contents into the cylinder and let the water run through. She placed her hand beneath the cylinder and held it above a dish of soil taken from the old riverbed where the oldest roots still kept secrets. The water reached the soil as a thread. The soil absorbed it with the reverence of an animal that remembers how to drink. Mira watched the thread and imagined the jar in the registry that it once had been part of. Ela poured from 3 more jars, then closed the cylinder. The office announced the locations where small volumes of the water would be distributed, not for drinking, not for ritual, but for sealing onto the roots of plants that had survived under care. The city needed no larger gesture. It had made do with smaller ones for years, and had learned their power. After the gathering, Mira stood with Ela near the tower as the crowd thinned. The 2 women did not tell each other that they had done well. That was not how the city worked. They stood with their hands at their sides and let the air cool their skin. Mira thought of the registry's lobby, of the sentences on the walls, of the maps that now looked less like diagrams and more like a language. She thought of the jars still on the shelves, not as trophies, but as letters from a brief exchange with a visitor. A month passed, and then another. The city's daily music returned to its recent default. People woke early, worked, hid, tended, cooked, calculated, slept. The registry continued to fill with precise absences. The weather office continued to issue advisories that aligned bodies with the least harm possible. Mira's exhibit was visited and then grew less visited, and she was relieved. Exhibits are not meant to be permanent replacements for the world. They are bridges between moments. One morning, Mira found a small package on the registry's threshold. The package was wrapped in the careful paper of someone who had learned to wrap well when wrapping mattered. Inside was a single broad leaf pressed between 2 pieces of glass, not brittle, not fully preserved, a survivor that had not been expected to last. The leaf had been annotated on the edge with a sentence in a soft hand. The sentence asked nothing and claimed nothing. It described the exact sound that had been missing from the city and had returned. It described it without metaphor or analogy, only with the kind of patience that distinguishes one sound from another and can be taught. Mira held the glass up to the window light. The leaf held a landscape within it of veins and branchings and dry valleys. If water ever returned to run along those corridors, the leaf would not feel it. The leaf was already on the other side of living. But she imagined new leaves next season on the same plant. She imagined the jar in the registry, labeled with the night and the hour and the corner of the city where it had been filled. She imagined a child finding the maps and learning to read them the way one learns to read stories where the characters are streets and the plot is weather, and the ending refuses to settle. The registry never expected to accomplish fame. It expected to accomplish something like alignment between the inner registers of a human life and the outer registers of a place under pressure. It expected to keep people conversant with their own surroundings. It took in what might be trivial and returned it labeled as not trivial. It drew lines between the way a mother kneaded dough and the way cloud cover diffused light, and the way a boy could tell the time of day by the sound of worms in a planter. It took these lines and offered them to people whose jobs had become to keep others fed and cooled and calm. Mira's days continued in a pattern that felt less like repetition and more like recitation. She woke, she prepared the room, she accepted the cue, she wrote. She kept her body in order to do this. She ate with attention even when the food was a series of known items. She slept with attention even when sirens whined in the distance. She did not cultivate hope as an abstraction. She cultivated hope as a dependable outcome of well-executed tasks, and then left room for surprise. Surprise did not always arrive as an event to be recognized. Some days it arrived as a small change in the way light pooled on a floor. Some days it took the form of a delivery. The city had learned to trust deliveries less. The wrong thing in the wrong packaging could cause difficulty for weeks. But this delivery bore the stamp of a friend of the registry, and inside was a set of old recordings that had been digitized by a teacher who had kept archives in her attic. The recordings contained the sound of storms from a decade when storms had still been regular. The teacher had worried that giving them to anyone would be like offering a wound. She had given them to the registry because it understood how to place wounds carefully. Mira listened at her desk after the queue had thinned. The recordings were not the kind that playfully overlay rain with music. They were clean, unadorned, the work of someone who had pointed a microphone at a window and left it there for hours. The sound made a shape in the room. The room seemed to develop corners it did not have. Then the sound changed as the recording shifted location. The microphone came to a rooftop and took in the city from above. Mira heard horns, far off, heard the echoes in alleys, heard footsteps on wooden ramps that had been replaced years ago by metal. The rain made all of it coherent in a way that memory alone could not. She did not play the recordings in the lobby. That would have turned the exhibit into a recreation and would have caused people to misalign their senses, searching for the night to return in the same shoes. She placed one small speaker in the back room and invited visitors who wanted to spend a few minutes to sit there alone and listen, not to what had happened to the city, but to what it had sounded like when the city had possessed a different overlay. She told them, without telling them, to take the sound with them, not as a hunger, but as grammar. Children took to the recordings differently than adults. They had no picture of the old city in their minds. They did not overlay the sound with images of coffee shops and umbrellas. They listened and then went to the sink at home and tried to simulate it with a tilted pot and their fingers. They dragged small wheeled toys through shallow bowls and heard the difference in pitch that weight made. They translated sound into mechanics and mechanics into knowledge that could be used to keep small systems going. The registry received notes from parents who were wary of water as a subject because it caused a certain grief in the house. The notes explained that the recordings had not deepened grief. They had opened a bordered space where water could be discussed as a phenomenon rather than a verdict. As summer leaned into its fullest shape, the city grew hotter than the year before. Everyone admitted that they had hoped this would not be the case, at least this season. The Weather Office issued advisories that included small innovations, invented because the old advice simply had nowhere left to go. People learned to share the burden of one functioning evaporative cooler between two apartments, 2 hours each. People learned to store cold in concrete and to release it. People learned where stairwells maintained the kind of temperature gradients that allowed an elderly neighbor to rest without humiliation. People learned to walk slowly in the middle of the day, not as a display of weakness, but as a disciplined survival technique. The rain did not return. The jars sat. Their contents did not evaporate because Mira had learned the seals of such vessels. But they were never meant to be museum pieces. They were meant to be letters from one living thing to another. The letters waited to be reread. Mira sometimes held one and tilted it, watching the thin surface shift against glass. She could tip it just enough to send a thread toward the lip. She could image releasing it to a plant that needed a symbol more than a drink. She chose not to. Symbols in this city had to be managed as carefully as resources. To spill from a jar without reason could become a story that required correction for weeks. She would wait for a reason. The reason arrived in a form that almost nobody liked. A developer in a neighboring municipality purchased the rights to a portion of the old riverbed on his side of the border and began to propose a set of structures that would stand as an oasis branding move for his portfolio. The proposal did not include any water of its own. It included a series of green-painted shades and imported stones and a small amphitheater for events. The developer named the project with a word that used to mean relief and now meant marketing. The city's people did not have the strength to mount a large protest. They wrote letters. They submitted alternate designs drawn in pencil, designs that included channels for the day when water returned in small or large measures. They pointed out that the old riverbed was a thoroughfare of memory, essential to keeping citizens from disintegrating under pressure. The neighboring municipality held hearings and then shifted hearing dates until people were too tired to come. Ella visited the registry a day after one such postponement. She brought no instrument. She carried on her face the expression of someone who had calculated a change in a system and found it both small and unacceptable. She stood by the shelves where the jars were labeled. She did not look at them. She looked at the ledger where Mira had written descriptions of the recordings. She read, nodded once, and then turned toward the window. Mira followed her to the glass. The sky was neither promising nor threatening. It was the sky the city had known most days for years. The heat advisory lights on the tower blinked with their practiced beat. Children in the alley were using carefully rationed water to make a small channel for marbles. They would return the water to the potted plants afterwards. Mira thought of the developer's project and felt a flare of anger that she did not often allow herself in the registry, because anger is a solvent that dissolves precision. She placed her hand on the window frame and steadied her breath. The jars were letters. Letters can be addressed. Mira wrote 3 letters that afternoon to 3 different addresses. One was for the council. One was for the neighboring municipality's planning commission. One was for the developer himself, named carefully, not to shame him, because shaming produces a brittle pride that is expensive to repair, but to draw him into a conversation where the cost of his plan could be measured in units he had not included. The letters did not threaten. They invited. They invited everyone to the registry's lobby on a certain evening when the exhibit would be slightly changed. Mira did not outline what she would do in the letters. She did not need to. The city had learned that if the registry announced a change in an exhibit, the change would be a research action disguised as a display. People arrived with their reserve and their good shoes. The developer arrived with a jacket and an assistant who had the eyes of a person whose job was to observe the good shoes of others. The council members arrived without insignia. The planning commission sent 2 representatives who sat together on a bench and did not speak. Ella stood by the tower until the last blue light blinked for the evening, and then joined the crowd. Mira stood without standing on a stage, because stages distorted everything. She used no microphone because the lobby carried sound. This was a decision made long ago by an architect who had known how to listen. She began by reading a set of sentences from the walls. She did not embellish. She moved to the maps and laid one over another to show the difference between 2 courtyards. She opened the small wooden box where the recordings had been copied onto simple, durable drives. She placed one drive on the table and indicated it could be signed out for 24 hours at a time, like a library book. Then she walked to the shelf where the jars had been arrayed into a sequence that communicated direction. She took one jar down and held it at shoulder height. The jar held the amount from one bowl on one sill on the night the city briefly learned again what it was like to have an event that could be called weather. She held the jar and did not explain that she did not do ceremonies. She had no criticism for those who did. She simply performed an act that was both less and more. She uncapped the jar and poured its contents into a shallow tray, holding soil from the old riverbed. The sound was almost nothing. The impact was real. The soil darkened just a shade. The smell lifted into the lobby and made its way into noses that had long been trained to be skeptical of any good sign. The smell did not promise rain. It promised contact between one thing and another under conditions that made survival possible. Mira waited until the smell settled. She placed the tray on a pedestal at the entrance. She did not pour more. She did not make a waterfall in the room. She did not waste a single drop beyond the step she had taken. She looked at the developer without accusation. She looked at the planning representatives without pleading. She looked at the council as one looks at colleagues. She asked that the portion of the old riverbed under discussion be considered as a working archive, not a park, not a promenade, not a branded oasis, a working archive of water behavior and human adaptation. She asked that the developer consider building his amphitheater not as a stage for scheduling events, but as a tiered classroom where children could bring their marble channels after a brief rain and measure flow. She asked that the plan include not imported stones, but the stones that were already there, mapped by number, so that stones could be returned to their exact positions if someone moved them. She asked that the green shades be replaced by structures that taught shade, that made shade measurable and present, that explained to a child reason and effect while leaving a cool patch to sit in. She did not ask for water the city did not have. She asked for capacity that would alter the course of grief by offering a skillful path. The lobby held its breath, not because the request was imbued with ceremony, but because it was usable. The developer's assistant wrote rapidly. The planning representatives whispered and then stopped themselves. The council members looked at one another with that unreadable expression that means a proposal fits within a category that cannot be dismissed outright. Ella stepped forward, not as a scientist, but as a citizen. She described without display the pieces the weather office could contribute. Old instruments could be installed in the archive as pedagogic tools. New sensors could be embedded to capture the behavior of water whenever it arrived, however briefly. Data could travel to schools and kitchens. People could learn to forecast their courtyards. This was not the promise of rain. This was the promise of a population more difficult to fool. Nothing was decided that night. But 2 weeks later, the neighboring municipality issued a revised plan. It adopted the term working archive. It replaced 3 of the most egregious decorative features with functional, mapped elements. It included a small amphitheater that offered no scheduled entertainment, but much to see after weather. It paid for a set of hoses to be run from municipal storage so that after one of the office's controlled releases from upstream, which still occurred once a season, people could direct a fraction of flow across mapped courses without competing too violently for turns. It included a line about the registry that named Mira's lobby a research collaborator, which made her laugh quietly in her apartment and then breathe with relief. The archive opened in a month with no ribbon. It began as a set of stones and plans. It would become itself the first time water entered, and the people did exactly as they were meant to do. They did not clap. They did not take pictures to shout with. They moved, placed, routed, measured, argued without rancor, cleaned, and then returned what they had used. Mira stood on the edge and watched a boy who had learned from the marble channel bring his skill against a slightly larger scale. He failed twice, then shifted his angle and succeeded, and everyone nearby felt the small click of a city fitting a new notch in its understanding. On the night that the second rain reached the city that season, if two in a season can be called a season, Mira did not sit at her window. She went to the working archive with a small group of neighbors. She brought no jars. Others did. She left them to their collecting. She took a broom and moved silt from one place to another. She moved her broom again and again. She did not stop to imagine capturing sound. She immersed herself in practicalities with a happiness so quiet that it did not announce itself even to her. Afterward, she returned to the registry and added a line to a ledger. The line did not record her broom. It recorded the smoothness of a particular stone in the archive after the water found it again. She wrote the number of the stone and the time. She put the ledger away and slept. In the morning the city smelled not like redemption, but like work that would continue. People washed their faces with more care. They swept their steps. They drank slowly. They told each other two kinds of stories, what had happened and what they had done. The two balanced one another in a way that made both sustainable. The registry received fewer requests for a few days, not because people had nothing to preserve, but because they were busy being the subject of what might later be preserved. Ella stood at the tower with her hand on the small anemometer. Her other hand cradled one empty jar. She had planned to bring it to the registry, and now found she did not want to give it away. She did not want property. She wanted a tool to be in her hand when the air made a choice. She stood like that, between instruments old and new, between jars filled and empty, between a city that had learned some small grammar and a sky that had its own narrative threads. She smiled with the minimal extravagance of someone who approves of the ratio between effort and grace.